Definitely, yeah. I find it's rewarding. And it's kind of a nice contrast to the touring side of work as well. 'Cause it's very much on your own time. It's in the studio. It's a nice thing to do.
Welcome to the Producertech podcast with myself, your host, Sam Clouston. The Producertech podcast is a new medium for us to explore the relationships between the creators and the music, the engineers and the mixers, and the artists and the albums. We're going to explore a variety of topics and ideas, covering all bases of music production. In today's episode, I spoke to Paul Maddox, a producer, DJ and educator who has worked with Producertech for many years and has provided us with some of our most popular courses. He is one half of Techno duo Spektre, who have embarked on tours worldwide and have played to sold-out audiences around the world. We discuss his background in hard house, the effects of the pandemic on being a professional musician, and how becoming a production tutor helped hone his craft, and much, much more. This is episode 2 of the Producertech podcast with Paul Maddox. Hi, we're here for episode 2 of the Producertech podcast with Paul Maddox. Paul, how are you doing today?
Hi mate, how you doing? Yeah, I'm all good. Good to be on here.
Good. What you been up to recently, musically and such?
So Rich and I, who I do my Spektre project with, have just got back from a little short weekend tour in the States. We did, Vegas on Friday and LA on Saturday, which are both really good shows. That's the short past. And then, the rest of the week. A couple of days recovery, and then I've just been working on a few bits of client work. I do quite a lot of mix downs and mixes and mastering, that kind of thing for people. So yeah, a bit of client work. So not written any music this week, but been busy.
Well, I mean, you've earned yourself some time off from that. Don't worry. That sounds like a very busy schedule. Is that something that you enjoy doing, or is it quite stressful? Or
yes to both. I love it. It's good being busy. And the schedule's always kind of, in this business, it's kind of it's always up and down. Like you'll have periods where it's everything all happens at once, and then you'll have little sort of naturally occurring periods where you've not got as much on. And I haven't got a hugely hectic summer actually, which in some ways it's nice. It's quite nice being able to have time to do some normal person things at the weekends. But then equally you're never complaining when the diary's busy either. So yeah, it's just take it as it comes, I think.
Yeah, it's quite a different lifestyle. I mean, I've never been a full-time musician myself, but I know quite a few, and it comes with a few cons, but mostly pros from the sound of things.
Yeah, definitely. Well, I mean, the thing is, most of the cons are kind of pros as long as you enjoy it. I think that's the bottom line. Like if it got to the point where you weren't enjoying the shows, then the traveling isn't worth it. But as long as you're enjoying the reward at the end of the effort, then it's worth it, definitely.
Yeah. Do you think that you have to be a certain type of person to be able to travel that much, and obviously it's a lot of late nights and a lot of DJs obviously drink and stuff, but I've seen quite a lot of DJs now are kind of going teetotal because I think it helps with the lifestyle.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think anyone can adapt to it, but it is a case of adapting to it. I guess it's similar to people who work night shifts and things like that. You kind of have to get into the habit of having a bit more flexibility with your body clock, really. Like sort of sleeping when you can, get certainly. I mean, when I was in my early to mid 20s, I could do the late nights and just power through, do whatever you need to do to get through the night, and then sort of not suffer from it afterwards. Whereas I'm 40 this year, and it's definitely it's more about naps than powering through for me these days. But nice. take them when I can get them. So it's all good, yeah.
Well, yeah, as you mentioned, you've been doing this music thing for a while. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how you started, what got you into music, your first DJ shows, your first records, etc.
Yeah, sure. So I first started out making, well, in fact, at the very beginning, I was, a bit of a technology, a bit of a computer geek, basically, as a teenager. And started messing around making, kind of bootlegs, basically, throwing acapellas over tracks, that kind of thing, Toka's Miracle, Tree of Love Dies type stuff. And Yeah, I sort of did a bit of that. I was having a few of those tunes played out on regional radio and sort of local clubs and stuff like that. But not even proper clubs. Places where you go drinking when you're 17, those kind of clubs.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
but kind of was enjoying it basically and getting a little bit of a little bit of feedback from it. There was other people were into it. It wasn't just me doing it in my own bubble. So yeah, then kind of did that. Progressed a little bit further, started going out properly clubbing, as it were, actually going out for the music rather than just out in going out drinking. And then got into the UK hard house thing, which was massive around that time. So this is around about sort of around about 2000, 2002. So got into that scene, and then the two things married up really. I'd always been dabbling with making music, which then obviously I then started making the music that I was hearing when I was out. And as a result of that, got a position, got a job, kind of an apprenticeship really, unofficially, as the in-house producer at Tidy Tracks, who was sort of one of the big labels in that scene at the time. Who handily were based really close to where I'm from. So yeah, and then that worked there for probably 4 or 5 years, actually, as the in-house studio bod there. And yeah, then eventually that kind of, they didn't have a need for somebody in-house anymore. I'd kind of, wanted to do some more different things outside of that sort of envelope. And yeah, sort of moved on and took it from there really, on the production side. And the DJing kind of has always gone alongside that. Did my first actual proper gig, a solo gig at one of the Tidy Weekenders, which is their big flagship event. And then Spektre came a few years later, when I was wanting to sort of broaden the horizons a little bit, and that's been my primary project as an artist since then, really.
Yeah. It was interesting actually. Something I picked up on was the fact that you managed to get that position as an in-house producer. I feel like a lot of people, especially young people at college, university, that's the kind of goal of theirs, to get a kind of a mix, whether it's being an engineer or a mastering or a producer in-house, but obviously they're very rare opportunities.
Yeah, I mean, probably rarer now than they were 20 years ago as well, to be honest, because I think there's far fewer organizations now that even have a house to be in. Tidy at the time actually had a like a physical headquarters where everybody worked under the same roof, same couple of roofs. Whereas, there's very few labels now, in the sort of dance music industry, at least. Obviously you've got your majors, but in the dance music industry, there's very few labels that are, have enough staff and enough permanent people or any real need to be physically based in one place. I could only think of probably Tool Room, maybe Defected, one or two others that have actually got, an office per se, where everybody's based. I think everyone else kind of does things from, even the label managers will be working from home in a lot of instances. So I think those, I mean, they will have people that they work with regularly, of course, but, I think those true in-house positions, like in the independent sort of side of things, probably are very rare these days, I would think.
I've just been thinking, I wonder what's caused that. Maybe it's the fact that everyone has DAWs at home now, or
it's a mixed bag. I mean, partly it's that you don't need as much of a facility to do it. Like the room that we had there was full of old 90s, late 80s MIDI gear, and you couldn't do everything in the box in the same way that you can now, for better or for worse. But you needed a studio to do it. You couldn't just have a laptop with a pair of monitors or a pair of headphones. So it's partly that, and I think partly as well it's just how tight the margins are for independent labels now. Like back when you could sell 100,000 copies on vinyl, there was enough money to employ a few members of staff. Whereas if you just do digital downloads and getting your like 0.001 pence per stream on Spotify or whatever it is, there's the niche where there's a business that can make enough money to employ a number of full-time staff on those kind of margins is probably, there's not many of them really.
It's a good point. I hadn't really thought about it before, but I'm sure people will hopefully be listening and thinking, how do I navigate this world now? obviously you were telling us, what sort of age did you start producing? Was it 18, 17, 18, did you
I
say?
probably started producing the very early kind of messing around, probably younger than that, like 16 or
Okay.
so. Yeah, I was probably around about 18 at the point where I did anything that was worth worth sending to anybody else. But yeah, I was dabbling and having a little mess around probably while I was still at school. So yeah, I would have been 16, something like that.
Yeah, so what I was going to ask was, in the sort of days before, I mean, DAWs were kind of emerging in the early
Mm.
2000s. So was this DAWs, or was it all hardware? Are you a hardware
Yeah,
guy,
no.
or are
So
you?
initially, I was using. I think it was pre the term DAW being coined, really. But I was using Sonic Foundry, later Sony Acid originally, which was the
Yeah, I've heard
first
of that.
kind of audio centric sequencer. It was the first time you could kind of warp things. It wasn't as good as Ableton or something now, but you could kind of time stretch things, and you had a bit of flexibility like that. You could drop loops in and have them be timed to your project, which was quite novel at the time. So yeah, I was always a computer based, just because of my background. I was always computer based from the start, really. Even though the sort of computer, DAW side of things was quite poor at that point. So I used Acid for a while, which was audio only. You couldn't do MIDI in it at that point. Then moved on to Cakewalk, which was what later became Sonar. And then Cubase. They would sort of that was the sort of progression at the beginning. But yeah, I was always software centered, actually, because I came from that kind of IT geeky kind of background rather than being from a working on Akai MPC or anything like that.
Mm.
But then the sequencer side of things was pretty good then, like whether it was, Cubase on the Atari or Cakewalk or whatever, Octamed on the Amiga, like there was always sequences for MIDI that worked pretty well on those earlier computers. But it was the power for doing the plugin side of it that was really not there at that point. Like the soft synths now are, barely distinguishable from the hardware in a lot of cases. Whereas back then, the ones that did exist weren't very good, and even the best of those, absolutely rinsed your computer when you were trying to use them. So I then kind of moved to a sort of hybrid setup using a few bits of hardware, so doing the audio side of things in the computer, but then all the synths and samplers and stuff like that would have been outboard, and then it would have been mixed outboard as well.
Yeah, no, it's always fascinating speaking to producers, because it's always done quite friendly and jovially, but like the kind of war between in the box people and analog people, and obviously most people are actually somewhere in the middle. I can see in the background there it might be a synth behind you.
What over this side?
Yeah.
It's an RD9. Yeah, it's the Behringer 909 clone. Which, to be honest, we've actually only really been using in live performance rather than in the studio. To be honest, it's sat on the side with probably a fairly thick layer of dust on it because we, it was last used for the Spektre live shows that we did last summer. So it's not really been touched.
Yeah.
But on that tip, I always think anyone who's really evangelical one way or the other kind of probably should spend less time discussing it and more time actually writing music, in my opinion. Like there's way more interesting conversations around music to be had than what equipment you're using to make it, in my view. But my I'm probably primarily in the box, mainly for convenience. I think there's certainly circumstances where hardware sounds better, and I think the margin by which it sounds better gets smaller every year. There's plugins coming out that are barely distinguishable, and certainly not distinguishable in context. It may well be that if you're, I don't know, comparing a plug-in version of a synth versus the hardware version of it, certainly with analog stuff, that there are certain edge cases where you can really tell the difference. But at the point where that sounds in the mix, buried amongst all the other things and doing its thing, there's such marginal gains that unless you're literally at the absolute pinnacle of your game and that last 1%, 0.5%, whatever, is gonna make the difference. Like, don't fucking worry about it. Just use what you've got and write some music, because that's by far and away the more important thing.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, there's a lot of gatekeeping in the music community, as I'm sure you know. I've come across it many times myself. I've often found myself having, because I've always been an in the box person myself, and you do get people kind of almost scoffing at you sometimes. But yeah, you just have to stick to your guns and know what you like.
Yeah, and that's precisely it. Because there may well be. It's not that I prefer working in the box, partly because I do several different projects. Like I do my own stuff, I do the Spektre stuff, and then I do, like I was saying to you before, some sort of client work, doing mixes and masters for people. So in a typical week, I'll be hopping backwards and forwards between, 2, 3, 4, 10 projects over the course of the week. And if I haven't got full recall on that, it would just be a complete nightmare. I wouldn't be able to do half of what I do. So everything has to be in the box from a, project point of view. But then I will use hardware synths occasionally, like things like 303s and things where you kind of, sometimes it's not even as much the sound, it's more the interaction, the sort of the physically being touching a thing and not looking at the screen that makes you, do things a little bit differently. It's quite useful. But I'll never be mixing it on an analog mixer. I'll always track those analog synths into Ableton, and then the audio's saved in Ableton.
Yeah,
and it's all mixed and saved in there anyway. So.
Yeah, you mentioned that you use hardware for your live shows with Spektre, and you just mentioned you've been on tour in America. What's your live experience like? Are you doing using CDJs or vinyls, or obviously you're using a bit of hardware as well?
So we've got two things. So the normal Spektre DJ show is CDJ based. So we have 3 CDJs and the Pioneer DJS 1000 sampler, which is really cool actually, which lets you do a few little bits of live jamming and stuff, but it means that we can turn up with 2 pairs of headphones, 2 USB sticks and just do it, rather than lugging boxes around, because it's a pain in the arse. It's if you're a band and if you're the Chemical Brothers and you've got roadies and sound techs and stuff to sort it all out for you, it's great. Like if you're 2 people and you've got to take it all on as hand luggage or risk it all getting lost, the simpler you can keep the setup, the better, really. So that's our normal DJ setup, which is what we do for 90% of our shows. But then we did actually do a Spektre Live thing, which we relaunched last summer and did a couple of festival shows with it, which is a bit more in depth. So that's where we had the RD9, a Prophet 1, Pro 1. What else did we have? 303, and we did use the DJS 1000 in that as well, actually. And then some stuff running off Ableton rather than just CDJs. But it was a bit of a different show. That was kind of more of a rehearsed show of all our own music. Little variations on our stuff. Rather than just a DJ set. So that's the exception rather than the rule. We do a few of those, but it's mainly a DJ set.
Yeah, it's a very different type of experience. I've seen a few DJs do their DJ sets and then their live shows, and I actually personally prefer live shows myself. But DJing from an artist's perspective is such a fantastic way to tour, because it's so, as you said, it's so easy. You can just walk with nothing but your USB in your back pocket.
100%, super easy. Yeah.
It's very good from a sort of almost like a financial perspective as a working musician. Sorry,
partly that, but also partly the venues that it opens you up to play in. Like our live setup isn't particularly for the live shows isn't particularly extravagant. I've certainly seen people with bigger rigs, but you still need a decent sized area to set it up in. You need to get there before the venue opens, or at least have a separate setup so that you can sound check before you go on. And if you're playing in like a 200-300 capacity club, that just isn't there. The DJ booth's barely got room for the equipment that lives in it, let alone another whole table's worth of stuff, So then, it just means that there's a lot of smaller venues that you can't play at. So yeah, if you're at the point where the smallest shows you do are 10,000 people, then fine, it's not a problem. But there's not that many people sort of coming through the ranks in underground dance music that are in that position. So, you've got to be pragmatic about it and think about where you're actually going to be playing rather than a sort of ideal scenario.
Yeah, obviously you've played massive crowds, and then I imagine you've played very small crowds at certain points in your career. Prefer either of them?
Different things, like there's the wow factor and the the buzz from seeing the crowd of somewhere huge. We've done some pretty big festival shows, and that's really cool. Whereas I actually think the bigger the stage, the more removed you are from the audience and the less interaction you feel like you've got. Like I think those big festival shows, you do it and you play your thing and people react and it's all good. But I at least always have that sort of niggling feeling. It's like we kind of could have played, if we made a mistake there or dropped the wrong tune, it wouldn't have made that much difference. Like whereas in a club where the front row are like in your face, you're really interacting, instantly. You'll literally see, there's a group of 20 people dancing there and they really went off to that melodic thing we played. Let's follow that up and sort of build the vibe. It's much more interactive and much more intuitive, I think, in a smaller venue where you can actually, see what people are feeling a little bit more, rather than just to see if people who are probably enjoying themselves, but kind of maybe don't even know who's on. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's more impersonal, I guess, the bigger shows, but cool to do. They look good on Instagram, but I enjoy the small ones more.
Yeah, you got to do it as well as you want to experience these kind of shows. But yeah, I can imagine that playing in a place where you're kind of changing your set on the fly based on the people's reactions is a different experience.
There's more skill to it, I think. I think anyone who's on doing a headline slot somewhere big, it's hard to fuck it up. Do you know what I mean? It's like, if people are there to see you, you've got a full, however many thousand people in front of you. You'd have to do a pretty bad job for them to all go. Whereas at a club where it's building and people can nip out for a fag, they can go to the second room quite easily. You've got a bit more, there's a bit more work to do and there's a bit more craft to it, I think.
I can also, sorry, I don't want you to think I'm spying around your room.
It's all right. I've got my sort of wide angle camera on the go. Yeah, it's all good.
I've just spied on the other side of the room. You quite a sizable vinyl collection. Is that something you're a collector or you're an enthusiast?
So to be honest, I was when I started DJing with the hard house and hard dance stuff. That was the format of choice. Like CDJs were just coming through really at that point, and I did always play CD as well to play new stuff. But the release format was vinyl. Beatport was kind of maybe had started, but it wasn't really it wasn't really the force that it is today. So if you wanted new music, vinyl was the format. So to be honest, I don't really buy vinyl anymore. Occasionally, if there's something that I want from a collection point of view, but it's mainly the vast majority of what's down there is sort of 99 to 2005 UK hard dance basically. So it was kind of I'll never get rid of it because it's there's a lot of what do you call it, sentimental value to it, but I wouldn't say I'm an active collector anymore really. No, just sort of just sort of guardian of the collection that I've got, but not a collector still.
It's probably worth a fair bit then, to be fair.
I mean, I don't know, it's quite a niche scene. Like, there's the odd record in there that's quite rare, but there's also a load of promos and stuff that I got sent that weren't even all that good. There's probably the Discog stuff. There's probably probably most expensive record in there is like 50 quid or something. I don't think there's any hugely rare ones in there, to be honest.
Did you have a sort of a relationship with a local shop?
So when I first started out, Chesterfield, which is the little town I grew up in, there was a record shop called Hudson's there that I used to buy stuff from. It was a real old-fashioned music shop. Like one half was one half was music, like tape CDs, and vinyl at the end, and then the other half was literally a music shop, as in sheet music and musical instruments and stuff. It was like the town's music shop of all kinds. So yeah, it's quite an interesting place. There's the little vinyl bit at the end where there was DJs hanging out. Then there was your teenagers coming in to buy the latest whatever top 40 stuff, and then there was the church organist coming in to buy a new book of hymns for Sunday. So it's quite an interesting melting pot of people.
I'll admit my geography isn't that fantastic, but is the nearest big city to Chesterfield Manchester or Sheffield?
It'd be Sheffield.
Sheffield. So
Manchester's not far away though. Yeah, it's sort of the north of the East Midlands basically. So it's on the edge of South Yorkshire. So yeah, Sheffield was the nearest big city, and I went up there, and there was a shop called Cool Wax in Sheffield that was much bigger, had much more dance music stuff in there. And I did actually move to Sheffield sort of in my early 20s as well. So then the shops in and around that area were sort of regular haunts as well.
Yeah, because Sheffield to me in the early 2000s was quite well known as like a sort of indie scene with the Arctic Monkeys and everyone coming out of it. But was it good?
It was both, yeah. So there was the huge indie scene there, but then there was also sort of around the turn of the century, I guess you call it, the the Gatecrasher was based there, which obviously was a massive trance super club. In that whole 2000s super club thing, there was like Gatecrasher, Cream, God's Kitchen, I guess, with the three big sort of northern super clubs, mainly playing trance. And I spent a lot of time in Gatecrasher, and there was a whole sort of ecosystem that grew around that as well, because Gatecrasher was such a huge destination for people going. There was a sort of whole like ecosystem of pre-parties and after parties and sort of warm-ups the day before and things all sprung up around it. Became a real little scene. So that was it was a big thing.
That sounds like a good city to
it was good. It was a fun place to be 20 years old for sure.
So you started off with hard house, but obviously you've developed over time. You mentioned trance there. Is that
Yeah.
something you still interested in?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, like I mean, again, more as a more as probably a nostalgia thing than anything else. You know, I had some really good times listening to that and going out to it in the in that era. So yeah, I don't really follow it anymore. I don't really sort of keep tabs on who's doing what. But yeah, the big the big tracks from that era. Rich, who I do Spektre with, was probably more into his trance than he was the hard dance thing as well. So that's there's a lot of influences from that stuff have gone into what we do as Spektre.
Yeah, no, it's trance has had almost a bit of a revival in the last couple of years. Not to the levels of early 2000s, but it's just fascinating because a lot of the genres that I like and that are becoming big, like UK garage, jungle, techno, have obviously had this like sort of 20-year cycle. People kind of say there's a 20-year cycle in music.
Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at drum and bass, like kind of in the early 2000s, it was, I mean, it hadn't died out, but it was, it was really niche. It was really, really underground again. Now like you're hearing sort of poppy drum and bass tracks on mainstream daytime radio. It's like anyone who predicted that 20 years ago would have been, like sent to the asylum probably.
Yeah, no, I know what you mean. I get quite a few adverts on YouTube and stuff, and I've started noticing almost all the soundtracks are like UK garage, drum and bass, jungle, techno, house. It's like,
and a lot of those sounds, like kind of even the sort of hard house, hard dance thing that I used to do. You're hearing a lot of those sounds creeping into other things now. You listen to some of the stuff on Patrick Topping's label Trick. A lot of that just sounds like old Euro sort of Dutch hard house to me. It's like come fully back round. And I think like the thing with those, like you say, the 20-year cycle thing, I think is that because it's a completely fresh generation of people hearing it, all those perceptions that people of the generation that experienced it the first time, there's things that you perceive as cool and uncool and whatever. And, hard house definitely was in the uncool category for most people. But, anyone who's going out raving now had never even heard of it, let alone heard of whether or not it was cool, so then people can experience it through an untainted lens a little bit, and they can just decide whether they like it or not rather than having any preconceptions of whether they should like it or not, I think.
Oh yeah, I'd never thought about it like that. I've thought about the 20-year cycle in many different genres, and obviously it kind of applies to loads of stuff. But yeah, it's interesting that stuff that could have been considered universally crap, basically, and get a revival and be taken really seriously by the critics, by the same critics.
And, I think Speed Garage is probably a good example. Baseline in Speed Garage is another one that was loads of people loved it and it was good music, but it was never cool. It was never sort of it was never one of the ones that Mixmag would be writing about. A cool Speed Garage release or whatever. Whereas now, it's come through and there's a fresh generation of people getting into it and appreciating it for what it is, which is really good music.
Hard house is a kind of a little bit more of a niche subgenre. For people listening who aren't as aware of it, what would you say is the defining thing about hard house?
That's a difficult one. I mean, because it was kind of a melting pot genre in the first place, really. It wasn't one like, you could say that something like dubstep or jungle drum and bass, there was such unique defining characteristics for those genres that you can say that is it, and there's it's very clearly identifiable. Whereas hard house was always really a melting pot of kind of a bit of house, a bit of ravey stuff. Like it first came around in the sort of mid to late 90s, and it was higher. It was house with a higher tempo basically, but with lots of bits of Belgian ravey, hardcorey kind of influences in there. So yeah, it's a tricky one, really. I mean, if anyone was interested, I would say if you're into sort of the history, there was 2 Tony DeVee mix albums on Global Underground, the Tel Aviv and the Tokyo one, and they're a really good. That's where it started, basically. Roughly, that's a good overview of where it came from. But yeah, it's kind of 140 to 150 BPM, I guess. Typically, a bit of room either side. High energy, usually quite fun. It wasn't super serious music. I think possibly that it suffered from that a bit because then there were points in time where it went from being fun to being silly. Do you know what I mean? I think a lot of the stuff that was actually quite cool, good, enjoyable music got tarred with the brush of the more over the top stuff that sometimes got a bit too much publicity, probably. But yeah, that'd probably be my in a nutshell. High energy, fun music in the 140s.
Yeah, I guess certain genres can be intimidating to people, especially with a fast speed. I think a lot of
Yeah,
people got put off by hardcore and speed garage and things like that because,
yeah.
and even stuff like footwork, because they just, some people just say, oh, it's too fast, or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah. And I mean, the thing is, I think, and a lot of that is in the techno scene right now, like the kind of stuff we do as Spektres in the sort of, yeah, the sort of low to mid 130s, I guess, tempo wise. Um, but there's a real resurgence of stuff at 150, what, even faster into the 160s, which isn't really my cup of tea, but like it's a new generation of people, and I think there's definitely an element that really fast, aggressive, over the top music is really good fun if you're just getting into clubbing and and everything that goes with that. And it is a young sound. I think it's and there's nothing wrong with that. I think that's a good sort of natural cycle of things. No doubt those kids going out listening to that stuff, right now, probably their tastes will change in time, and they will, but they'll probably look back on that stuff as fondly as I look back on the some of the probably not objectively good music that I was into in the early 2000s, but it'll always have a place in my heart.
Yeah, that's the only important bit, really, isn't it? I've read a couple of things over the last couple of years about that speeding up of dance music being
Mm.
linked to the pandemic and people having that kind of primal urge to dance, and it's just kind of in a good way gone out of
Yeah,
control.
definitely. And I think it's always kind of like I think that the pandemic kind of exaggerated everything because it kind of meant that all the change that might have happened over 2 years was all sort of compressed up and burst out in one go rather than,
Mm.
being as gradual as it would normally have been. But and I think there was definitely an element of, people who turned 18 during the pandemic, who couldn't go out clubbing. There was a whole 2 years worth of people who'd literally never been out, and been listening to music. And there definitely was a huge amount of pent up energy there that, people wanted to let rip. But then the pendulum does always swing as well. Like if you go back to the sort of mid to late 2000s, it was all 120 BPM minimal, and and then the backlash against that was things getting hard again. And like no doubt the sort of hard techno thing will burn itself out when everyone's at 165 or something, and the backlash against that will be that it'll all swing back to being really really down tempo and cool again. So it's just it's the natural cycle of things, I
Yeah,
guess.
yeah, yeah. The wheel turns and always
Exactly.
comes back. Yeah, well, during the pandemic, obviously, as a professional musician, you must have been quite heavily affected. One thing I was just thinking about whilst you were talking about that was, as a DJ, I imagine quite a lot of times when you're producing music, you then play, early demos, versions of it to crowds to see what works, what doesn't work. I
Totally.
imagine that process would have changed quite a lot over the pandemic. And actually, maybe did it allow you to go in new directions or?
Yeah, it was a bit of a roller coaster, to be honest, because it was obviously, um as doing music as a job, the vast majority of your income comes from shows. Even though you probably spend more time on the music, the most of the money comes from the performances. So yeah, it was obviously quite bad from that point of view. Like we're okay, we survived. We weren't in that too much of a precarious situation, but there was only so long it could have gone on for. You know, so there was a point where we were just feeling really feeling worried doesn't really inspire creativity. If you're feeling that everything feels very precarious and depressing, it doesn't really inspire you to want to write music, really. Not for me anyway. But then we did do a few more bits that were with some less clubby music, because as you say, we would normally, the process for writing club tunes is we write them, test them out, if it almost works, we fix it. If it doesn't work, we bin it. And if it nails it, we've done it. Like that's kind of the process. So but we did write a few more, just more less club centric pieces, basically, through the lockdown times. And then weirdly, actually, we kind of didn't really have much of an outlet for those. But then kind of once we started doing shows again, we sort of went back and revisited them and found that two or three of them at least had some good ideas in that kind of would work as club records that we would never have written that way in the first place. So it was quite good in a way. So we then went back and remixed a few of the bits that we'd done, that were a bit more chilled, and turned them into club tunes. There was a tune called Endless Days that we did that was quite a sort of dreamy breakbeaty piano thing. And we were like, yeah, that's actually really cool. Did a big sort of obvious techno mix of it, and that was the version that that became the A side in the end. So yeah, but it was a weird time. I'd be lying if I said it was a great creative break and a great thing. I'd rather it hadn't happened, but I'm sure everybody would. But yeah, there was some positives to it. It at least made everybody think about things in a different way, for better or for worse.
Yeah, no, Endless Days is a massive tune. That's my favorite one of yours.
Nice one, thank you.
Yeah, that is just euphoric. That's what.
Yeah, but we never would have written that, I don't think, as a club record in the first place. It was the fact that we'd done it as just messing around doing something different. But then we were like, yeah, actually, we almost treated it like a remix when we did the other version. As if somebody else had written the original version and we were remixing it, and it worked well.
Good. So thanks for giving this a lot of background about yourself, Paul.
All good, no worries. Hopefully it was interesting. I wasn't just waffling on too much.
No, it was really interesting. I don't have that much knowledge about that scene, so it was actually very informative.
Okay.
Hard House wasn't something I'd listened to too much before, but I did a bit of research before. I liked what I heard. I'm actually
you mentioned same as any genre, but
yeah. You mentioned a couple of tracks actually earlier. I'll stick them in the description for anyone who wants to listen.
Cool, man. Yeah, perfect.
And a link to some of your latest music. So yeah, we were going to move on to talk about your relationship with Producertech. So why don't we just kick things off and tell us how you came into contact with Rob and Producertech?
Good question. So yeah, I actually had been working already with Loopmasters a little bit. We did a Spektre sample pack quite a while ago now, like probably 12? It was quite early on in the Spektre project actually. So yeah, it must have been over 10 years ago now. We did a Spektre sample pack for Loopmasters. Matt from Loopmasters at ADE, I think, in Amsterdam many moons ago. And yeah, obviously the connection between the two companies was, just, I can't even remember how the initial conversation came about, to be honest, but I hadn't really done much teaching before. I do quite a lot of one-to-one sessions and engineering sessions with people, where people come to me to help them with the technical side of production. And I was doing back then. But I hadn't really taught before, and it was actually quite a nice experience doing a few videos. I think I might have done one or two little short videos actually for another website or a YouTube channel or something, but a very, very, very small one. So Producertech was the first place that I did anything, substantial. And it was a really nice experience actually, because it was I think teaching makes you think about what you're doing a bit more. There was a lot of things where I kind of knew how to do it, obviously, and I knew what I did. But it's not until you actually start trying to write a lesson plan or trying to explain it to other people that you think about why you do things. And so it's actually a really nice, it was a really nice way of understanding why I do what I do a bit more as well, actually. So it was, even though the sort of main aim is sharing your skills with other people, I think it's actually a good way to improve your own skills as well, because it makes you think about your own process and ask why you do certain things. And sometimes the answer might be, actually, why do I do that? I could do that a better way,
Yeah, I was wondering, have you ever come across something that you know how to do sort of intuitively, and then you realize you don't actually really know what you're doing?
Yeah, exactly. Or why you're doing it. Like I do it this way kind of because I've always done it this way, or because somebody showed me to do it that way and it worked, which is and there's nothing inherently wrong with that either. Like it's personally, I'm quite a curious person. I like to understand things rather than just do them. But equally, there's no, if you can do it, you can do it. Do you know what I mean? There's no, it's like, like language in a lot of ways. Like if you sort of gave me an English textbook for somebody who spoke English as a second language, there's probably loads of stuff in there that I wouldn't have a clue about. Past participles and whatever. But once you understand something well enough, you can just do it. And you kind of do it intuitively, which is fine from a doing point of view, but is no good from a teaching point of view. Because if you want to explain it to other people, you need to explain why and how, not just well, you need to explain why, not just how.
Yeah, we've had feedback from other tutors and educators over the years that it basically, teaching makes them better at what they do.
Definitely, I would agree with that.
You have to be able to simplify something that can be incredibly complex into layman's terms. So I imagine you find it rewarding. That's a big reason why people teach.
Definitely, yeah. I find it's rewarding. It's and it's kind of a nice contrast to the touring side of work as well. 'Cause it's very much on your own time. It's in the studio. It's a nice thing to do. And it's quite surprising actually how often, how often we'll be at a show. In fact, it happened just in LA the other day, actually. Be at a show, and you will be chatting to somebody, usually other DJs and people who are in the music side of it, who'll say, "Oh, I loved your that tutorial on Producertech, or you loved that video on how to do your kick drums or whatever," which is really nice. That makes it even more rewarding. Obviously, if from the stats that people are watching it and listening to it, but it's always really nice when people come and speak to you in in person and say that something that you've taught them has helped them to get better at what they do or learn something new.
Yeah, it's funny. I imagine that there's probably at least a few songs that you've heard and possibly like, and that person might have learned how to do that via one of your videos without you
Definitely,
ever realizing.
it's a really nice feeling. Like, I mean, actually, even before doing the videos, I was kind of doing engineering and like co-production for people. And a few of the guys who I worked with doing that, they'd come to me for a while, get better at what they did, partly with my help, but partly just through their own ability and their own intuition. But yeah, it's really nice then hearing tracks that they've gone off and done subsequently, and just hearing like a little technique or something in there and being like, I showed you how to do that, and it's cool. But then hearing how somebody else has applied, they'll take an idea that you might have shown them how to do, but applied it in totally their own way, and done their own thing with it. And it's, that's super satisfying.
So yeah, I mean, earlier on in the conversation, you mentioned that you went from, I think was it acid to cakewalk to Cubase.
Yeah, so I think that unless I've missed anything out along the way, so acid to cakewalk to Cubase, and then more recently, I say more recently, like 15 years ago, to Ableton. So yeah, that's. I feel like I'm kind of settled on Ableton now, unless there's some seismic shift or something massively changes. I think that's my forever DAW now. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, though, people quite often ask this. They're like, what should I use? And I'll say, well, I like Ableton for these reasons, but use what you like. They're all good. A free version of Reaper and a load of free plugins. You can make wicked music on that. Like the limitation isn't having applications or equipment or whatever these days. It's the technology side of it's so democratized now that it really is just if you've got the ideas, you can do it, which is great.
Yeah, you can essentially do the same thing in every DAW. I've seen some stuff online about people saying that they sound different, but I'm not sure that's true.
I think possibly like a few years ago, like going back a while, there was definitely an element that, because people certainly used to say when it was sort of Logic versus Ableton, that Logic sounded better. And I think part of that was that at that point, Logic's built-in effects were a lot better than Ableton's built-in effects. Before I think it was Ableton 9 or 10 when they redid EQ8 and added the glue compressor and all that stuff. Some of the Ableton built-in stuff wasn't, it was functional, but it wasn't great. Whereas Logic's built-in effects definitely have been better for longer. The built-in compressors and EQs and reverbs and stuff in Logic did sound better, which I think generally then the cumulative effect of working in that did sound better than the cumulative effect of working in Ableton. But for me, if you were using all third-party stuff and everything else being equal, I've never been able to hear a difference anyway, for sure. So
yeah, well, you've done obviously you've done an Ableton push course with us. Ableton pushes have just seemed to become more and more popular over the last few years. So I think it's definitely a good sort of area to focus on. The Ableton Push 2, which I don't own myself, but I'd love to get one. And I've had to play around with one. It's amazing. Obviously, you said you're an in-the-box kind of person. I suppose the thing, Ableton Push is kind of in the box, but kind of isn't.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of both. So I use Push quite a lot. I've got a Push 2 here, and I use it quite a lot, although I think it would be really interesting to see how somebody who was just starting out would develop if they used Push from the beginning. Right? Because I've always been a sort of keyboard and mouse producer, if you like. Just from my background. So I'll use, there's certain things I'll use Push for. Obviously for just as a MIDI controller, it's great. I love the scales mode for playing things in because I'm not really classically trained. I know enough to get by, but I'm not a musician. I wouldn't call myself a musician. So being able to kind of have a bit of a cheat mode when it comes to keys and scales and things is really handy on there as well. But there's a load of stuff that I rarely use that's really powerful, just because I can do it quicker the way I've always done it, by using the keyboard and the mouse. Whereas it'd be really interesting if somebody who was like, day one of producing had a Push, And then I feel like they'd probably end up using Ableton a bit more like an NPC, and focusing on the hardware and being less focused on the screen. But it'd be, but yeah, it's a great tool.
Yeah, people, I think in my experience, which I think is reflective of quite a few people at my level. I'm no professional producer, but it can sometimes break you out of a sort of, when you're an intermediate at something and you kind of get stuck in the same patterns of of producing. I think sometimes stuff like an Ableton push can pull you out of it quite effectively.
100%, yeah. And it kind of, one thing that in fact, you could do this on other controllers as well, but it kind of encourages you to perform a little bit more, I think, rather than when you do things with the keyboard and mouse or, on the screen, it's very, very prescriptive. You're like, right, I want to do this, so I'm going to do this. It doesn't encourage you to experiment as much. Whereas having a physical surface like the push, there's definitely a bit of a like, okay, let's put the sequencer in and just like, press some buttons, mess around. It encourages that, kind of playful experimentation a little bit more, I think, than a trackpad or a mouse and keyboard does.
Yeah, sorry, I should say this isn't an advert for Ableton Push. So it's just because you've done a course for it. Because I just realised I've been going on about it for about 10 minutes.
It's all good. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm always of the mindset. Like, if you think something's good, talk about it. Don't be shy about it. It's whether it's yeah. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Obviously, you've done a few other courses with us: Techno and House, Techno Pro tips. Any of those taught you anything about your own music that you didn't know, or?
Probably. I mean, the pro tips one probably a little bit less, because that's kind of a bit more, that's little nuggets of things that I already did and I already understood pretty well. Whereas the full course from scratch one definitely makes you think about the process a bit more. Like, okay, if you're starting from scratch, what is my process? How do I separate writing from arranging and arranging from mixing, for example? Or how do I, how do I generate ideas? Because they're the kind of things that you do intuitively when you've done it for a long time. But actually thinking about, like I was saying before, thinking about how you explain that process to other people definitely does make you analyze your own, your own way of working a little bit more.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Obviously, you've done quite a few live streams with us as well, which is something I think you probably live stream of Producertech's core producers and educators. You're probably one who live streams the most. It's always really informative because I feel like you get a slightly different side to what you see in the course, because it's a bit more off the top of your head. You can respond to questions and stuff.
100%, yeah. Like, and with the live streams, I try not to plan them too much. Like, partly because I'm a little bit lazy, but partly because it's quite nice. It's like I find that there's a good group of people on those, in the community at Producertech. And there's always people asking interesting questions. So I think the first one that I did, I planned it a little bit more. And then after that, I was like, do you know what? I'm going to go in with a really broad, loose, brief of roughly what I'm going to talk about. And then see what people want, because there's no point me, talking about how to make techno kick drums if all the people in the room make house, for example, or, talking about, how to process vocals if everybody makes instrumental music. There's, and I think, because that makes you think on your feet a little bit more, it's more fun, and and I think that kind of rubs off. If you're buzzing off the sort of reactiveness and excitement of it, it makes it a bit more fun for everybody, really.
I actually got a great tip from you from one of those live streams about using the sampler to like distort your kick drums.
Using the built-in filters.
Yes, the filters. Yeah, it was like I'd never thought of distorting something like that. I've always just used saturation and stuff, but
it's because those filters have got an overdrive on them, which is actually really nice. But because it's kind of buried in there as a, you think of the filters in the sampler or in auto filter as being quite utilitarian, being quite functional rather than creative. But actually, there's a lot of there's a lot of depth in there.
Yeah, no, it's good. We can wrap things up now. It's been really great to chat to you.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
I've got a couple of quick fire questions for you.
Sure, yeah, let's do it.
I thought might be quite fun. First record you ever bought?
So if we're talking about vinyl, it was a really obscure hard house record called The Train by CM, which it wasn't even really that good, to be honest, but I was I loved it at the time. And yeah, you know, in terms of other music, I can't even think, to be honest. So yeah, let's go with that.
Okay. All right. Yeah, that's a good answer. Best city you've played in?
That's a really difficult one.
You don't want to offend
So
anyone.
yeah, well, I mean, it's difficult because it's different venues. But I mean, one place that we've been to a lot and has always been wicked is Mexico in general, Mexico City, and also yeah, we did Guadalajara and a few other places. So it's a country rather than a city, but let's say Mexico.
Okay. Good answer. I like that. If you had to give someone one mixing trick that you could put into a very short amount of words, what would it be?
Are we talking? Yeah, so probably always check it on fresh ears. There you go. That's the concise version because
Solid.
if you've been listening for hours and hours on end, like nobody, the best mixer in the world, the best pair of golden ears in the world, isn't going to be objective about anything after you've been listening to it for 4 hours. Like, turn it off, go for a walk the dog, have a cup of tea, have a cigarette, whatever you do that isn't listening to music, and come back after an hour, and you'll spot things that you've been listening for like super easily.
I think over the years, people have realised that that might be one of the absolute most important things to learn.
Totally. Yeah.
So, great answer. And finally, a bit of a silly question: techno or house, if you had to choose one?
I'd have to choose techno, really. Yeah, it's simple as.
I like it. We'll keep it explanationless.
It's not very. I'm not very good at quick fire. I'll give you a quick answer and then talk about it for 5 minutes.
It's all good. It's all good. Listen, Paul, it's been really nice chatting to you. Thank you for sharing all of your information and
You're more than welcome.
Background with us. We'll leave lots of links to the description to your music, your channels, and the courses you've done as well. So,
perfect. All good.
Yeah. Have a great day.
Thank you very much. You too, mate. Catch you in a bit.
See you later. Bye.